From the outside, they were everything people believe a family should be. A quiet street, trimmed lawns, Sunday mornings that looked like they belonged in a magazine, and a home where laughter carried through open windows as if nothing in the world could ever touch them. If you had driven past that house, you wouldn't have slowed down, you wouldn't have wondered, you wouldn't have thought twice. But the truth is, the most dangerous stories rarely begin with chaos, they begin with comfort. And in this case, comfort became the perfect cover for something no one saw coming. Because one night, without warning, without noise, without a single cry for help, something inside that home changed forever. By morning, one person was gone, and the version of that family everyone believed in was gone with them. It started with a call that didn't feel urgent at first. A neighbor, concerned but calm, reporting something that didn't seem to make sense. The front door had been left slightly open overnight, which was unusual for a house where routines were followed closely. Inside, everything appeared undisturbed. No broken glass, no signs of a struggle, just silence. The kind of silence that doesn't feel empty but heavy. The kind that makes you question what happened in the hours before. When officers arrived, they expected to find a simple explanation. Maybe someone had left in a hurry, maybe it was nothing at all. But as they stepped further into the home, that expectation began to fade. Because sometimes it's not what you see that tells the story, it's what you don't. The living room looked untouched, as if time had paused in the middle of an ordinary evening. A blanket folded neatly over the couch, a television remote placed exactly where it belonged, family photographs lining the shelves with smiling faces frozen in happier moments. There were no overturned chairs, no scattered belongings, no evidence that anything had gone wrong. And yet something felt off. It was subtle, almost impossible to explain, but it lingered in the air. Investigators would later describe it as a feeling they couldn't ignore, a quiet signal that something inside that house didn't match the picture it was presenting. Because when a life disappears without a trace, the absence itself becomes the first clue. At first, the story offered to authorities seemed simple enough. A spouse, calm but concerned, explaining that everything had been normal the night before. Dinner had been quiet, the children had gone to bed, and nothing seemed out of place. There were no arguments, no tension, nothing that would suggest something had gone wrong. It was the kind of explanation that should have settled things quickly, but instead it raised more questions than it answered. Because when something truly unexpected happens, people tend to remember details differently. They hesitate, they second-guess, they struggle to piece together the timeline. But this version of events came too easily, too smoothly, as if it had already been rehearsed. As investigators began to look closer, small inconsistencies started to appear. Nothing dramatic at first, just details that didn't quite align, times that didn't match, statements that shifted ever so slightly when repeated. And while each one on its own could have been dismissed, together they began to form a pattern that suggested there was more to this story than anyone was being told, because the truth has a way of revealing itself, not all at once but in fragments. And those fragments were starting to point in a direction no one expected. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. A husband, a wife, a home filled with routines so familiar that nothing ever seemed out of place, at least not on the surface. Michael Reynolds and Laura Reynolds had built a life that looked steady, the kind of life people assume is safe simply because it appears consistent. When police arrived at their home that morning, they weren't walking into chaos. There were no shattered windows, no signs of forced entry, no overturned furniture suggesting a struggle had taken place. Everything was exactly where it should have been, arranged in a way that suggested the night before had ended like any other. And yet one person was missing, and the absence didn't match the calm that surrounded it. That contradiction stayed with investigators, because when something serious happens, it usually leaves a mark, and here it hadn't, or at least not one that could be seen right away. As word spread, the story quickly drew attention beyond the neighborhood. Headlines began to appear, each one raising more questions than answers. A family described as stable, now at the center of something no one could clearly explain. The focus turned to Michael and Laura, not because there was immediate evidence against them, but because they were the only ones who could account for what had happened inside that house. As their statements were reviewed, something began to feel incomplete. It wasn't just what they said, but how they said it. The timeline sounded clean, almost too clean, as if every detail had already been arranged before anyone asked for it. Investigators started to look closer, not just at the night in question, but at everything leading up to it, because moments like this rarely exist on their own. Questions started forming, the kind that don't go away once they've been asked. Who was really in danger inside that home, and had anyone recognized it before it was too late? What was being hidden beneath the routines that neighbors described as normal? And perhaps the most unsettling question of all, why did no one see it coming, not friends, not family, not even the people closest to them? The deeper investigators looked, the more it became clear that this wasn't just about a single night. There were details in the past that hadn't been fully understood, moments that seemed insignificant at the time but now carried a different weight. Because sometimes the truth doesn't begin with the incident itself. Sometimes it begins long before, waiting quietly until something forces it into the open, and in this case that truth had been buried for years, hidden beneath a version of life that everyone believed without question. Neighbors described Michael Reynolds and Laura Reynolds as the kind of couple people admired without hesitation, the kind you point to when conversations turn to stability, to commitment, to what a long-lasting marriage is supposed to look like. Michael was known as dependable, a man who showed up on time, worked hard, and carried himself with quiet confidence. Laura, on the other hand, had a warmth that made people feel comfortable the moment they met her. She was present in her children's lives, involved in the community, the type of person who remembered birthdays and checked in when something felt off. Together, they built a life that looked complete, not in a flashy way, but in a steady, reassuring one. Their home became a place where routines felt safe, where dinner was served at the same time each night, where laughter echoed in a way that made everything seem firmly in place. Friends would later recall how normal everything felt. Weekend gatherings, casual conversations, shared moments that never hinted at anything unusual. There were photographs that captured birthdays, holidays, small milestones that families often hold onto. Smiles that looked genuine, expressions that suggested comfort rather than strain. To anyone watching from the outside, there was no reason to question what they were seeing. Michael provided, Laura nurtured, and their children moved through life the way children are expected to, carefree, unaware of anything beyond their immediate world. It was a structure that seemed solid, built on years of shared experience. And yet, as time passed, there were small moments that didn't quite fit, moments that were easy to overlook unless you were paying close attention. There were pauses in conversations that lasted just a second too long, glances that didn't quite match the tone of the room, a shift in energy that came and went without explanation. At the dinner table, there were nights when the conversation felt forced, when laughter didn't come as naturally as it once had. Laura would occasionally seem distant, as if her thoughts were somewhere else entirely, while Michael maintained a sense of control that felt firm, sometimes too firm. None of it was enough to raise immediate concern, nothing that would lead someone to believe something was seriously wrong. But taken together, these moments began to form a subtle pattern, one that suggested the version of life being presented might not be the full picture. Because sometimes what looks perfect is carefully maintained. It's built on effort, on keeping certain things out of view, on making sure that what others see never reflects what's actually happening. And in the case of Michael and Laura Reynolds, that effort had been in place for longer than anyone realized. The smiles, the routines, the sense of normalcy, all of it held together by something that hadn't yet been fully understood. But as investigators would eventually discover, that version of perfection wasn't as stable as it appeared. It was something that had been held together over time, something that required constant balance. And slowly, without anyone fully noticing, that balance was beginning to shift. Behind closed doors, in moments no one else could see, the performance they had maintained for so long was starting to crack. It didn't happen all at once. There was no single moment anyone could point to and say that's when things shifted. Instead, it started small, almost unnoticeable at first. Arguments that ended quicker than they used to, not because they were resolved, but because they were avoided. Conversations that once felt natural began to feel measured, as if every word was being chosen carefully. The laughter that used to carry through the house became less frequent, replaced by stretches of silence that lingered longer than they should have. Michael Reynolds remained composed, consistent in the way he presented himself, but there were moments when that composure felt rigid, less like calm and more like control. Laura Reynolds, once open and expressive, began to withdraw in ways that were difficult to define but impossible to ignore if you looked closely enough. There were questions that began to form, though no one asked them out loud. Financial strain was one possibility, subtle shifts in spending habits, small decisions that hinted at pressure building beneath the surface. Then there were the late nights, moments when one of them would stay awake longer than usual, phone in hand, screen lighting up in the dark. messages that weren't explained, calls that ended quickly when someone else entered the room. It didn't point clearly to anything, but it added another layer to the growing sense that something wasn't right. And then there was the dynamic between them, the way Michael watched more closely, the way Laura seemed increasingly aware of that attention. It wasn't obvious, not in a way that would alarm anyone immediately, but it was there, subtle and persistent. Friends began to notice changes, though they struggled to describe them. It was in the tone of conversations, the way plans were cancelled more often, the slight hesitation before answering simple questions about how things were going. When they were together, Michael and Laura still presented a united front, still smiled, still engaged in the way people expected. But underneath that, something felt strained, as if maintaining that image required more effort than it once had. No one imagined it was serious, not to the point where it would lead to anything irreversible, because from the outside it still looked manageable, still looked like something that would pass with time. But what no one realized was that these weren't isolated moments. They were connected, part of something building quietly over time. And then came the night that would change everything. A night that on the surface began like so many others before it, with routines that felt familiar and predictable. Dinner was served, conversations were had, the house settled into the rhythm it had followed for years. There was nothing dramatic, nothing that would have signaled what was about to happen, but within those ordinary hours, something shifted in a way that couldn't be undone. Because sometimes, the moment everything changes doesn't announce itself. It happens quietly, in the space between what is seen and what is hidden, and by the time anyone realized it had happened, it was already too late to go back. It was a normal evening, at least in the way normal had come to be defined inside the Reynolds home. Dinner was finished, dishes cleared, the house settling into that familiar quiet that comes at the end of the day. Michael Reynolds moved through the routine without hesitation, every action controlled, every movement measured. Laura Reynolds followed the same pattern she always had, but there was a distance in her presence that hadn't always been there. It wasn't obvious, not something you would notice unless you were looking closely, but it was enough to change the tone of the room. As the hours passed, the house grew quieter, the kind of quiet that feels heavier than usual, as if something unspoken was sitting just beneath the surface. Nothing outwardly wrong, nothing that would have drawn attention from anyone outside those walls, just a stillness that didn't feel entirely right. Time moved forward the way it always does, steady and indifferent. At some point the lights went off, doors were closed, and the house slipped into darkness. What happened next didn't come with warning. There were no raised voices that carried through the walls, no sudden crash that would have broken the silence. No one called for help, no one reached out to anyone outside that home. If there were sounds at all, they never traveled far enough to be heard. And that absence of noise would later become one of the most unsettling parts of the entire case. Because when something serious happens, there is usually a moment where it reveals itself, even briefly. Here there was nothing, just silence uninterrupted, complete. By morning the routine should have continued the way it always did, but it didn't. One person was gone, and the explanation that followed didn't carry the weight it needed to. Michael Reynolds spoke calmly, offering a version of events that suggested confusion rather than urgency. Laura Reynolds was described as missing, possibly having left during the night without explanation. There was no clear reason, no immediate evidence pointing in any direction. It was presented as something unexpected, something that didn't make sense but might eventually be explained, and yet from the very beginning it felt incomplete. The details didn't align in a way that satisfied the questions being asked, because when someone disappears without a trace, especially from inside their own home, the story behind it has to hold together. And in this case it didn't. At first it looked like a disappearance, the kind that leaves more questions than answers but still allows room for hope. Laura Reynolds had no history of leaving without explanation, no pattern of behavior that suggested she would simply walk away from her life, but in the early hours of an investigation, possibilities are kept open. Detectives moved through the Reynolds home carefully, documenting everything, paying attention to what was there and what wasn't. The front door showed no signs of forced entry, windows were intact, locks undisturbed. It suggested something important, that whoever was responsible hadn't needed to break in. That detail alone began to narrow the possibilities, shifting the focus inward rather than outward. Because when access isn't forced, it usually means it was allowed, or it was never needed in the first place. As interviews continued, the inconsistencies in Michael Reynolds' account became harder to ignore. Small changes in timing, slight adjustments in wording, details that didn't match earlier statements. None of it was dramatic on its own, but together it created a version of events that felt unstable. Detectives began comparing what was said with what could be verified, and slowly the gaps started to widen. Then came the physical evidence, subtle at first but impossible to dismiss. A trace that had been cleaned but not completely removed, something that suggested an attempt had been made to erase what happened rather than explain it. Digital records added another layer, messages that had been deleted, gaps in communication that raised further questions about what had taken place in the hours before Laura was reported missing. By this point, the direction of the investigation had changed. This was no longer being treated as a situation where someone had simply left. The evidence pointed towards something far more deliberate, something that required planning, or at the very least, a conscious decision made in a critical moment. And all of it led back to the same conclusion, that someone inside that house knew exactly what had happened, even if they weren't ready to say it out loud. The focus tightened, the pressure increased, and the version of events that had been presented at the beginning began to fall apart under closer scrutiny. Because when the truth is hidden, it rarely stays that way for long, especially when every detail is being examined from every possible angle. And then, as investigators expanded their search beyond that single night, they found something no one had been expecting. It wasn't just about what had happened to Laura Reynolds, it was about what had been happening long before that night ever took place. Records, reports, moments from the past that had never been fully connected began to surface, each one adding context to a situation that had initially seemed isolated. What they uncovered suggested a pattern, not identical in every way, but similar enough to raise serious concern. It pointed to behavior that hadn't started recently, but had existed quietly over time, unnoticed or unreported in a way that allowed it to continue. And that realization changed everything, because this wasn't just about a single incident anymore. It was about something that had happened before, something that had been missed, and something that, if understood earlier, might have changed the outcome entirely. The truth finally came out slowly, piece by piece, until there was no version of the story left to protect. What investigators uncovered pointed to something that had been building over years, hidden beneath routines that looked ordinary from the outside. Laura Reynolds had not simply disappeared, and the home that once felt safe had been holding far more than anyone realized. Evidence showed a pattern of control that had gone unnoticed, moments where tension had crossed a line but never reached the point where it demanded outside attention. That night, something shifted beyond repair, and what followed was not panic, but an attempt to reshape what had happened into something that could pass as an accident. But the details didn't hold, and the truth forced its way through in ways that couldn't be explained away. In the courtroom, the image of Michael Reynolds that had once been so widely accepted began to fall apart under scrutiny. Testimony revealed inconsistencies, not just from that night, but from years leading up to it. Laura's distance, her quiet withdrawal, the subtle changes people had noticed, but never questioned deeply enough, all of it began to make sense in a way that was difficult to ignore. The version of life that had been presented for so long was replaced with something far more unsettling, a reality where control had replaced trust, where silence had taken the place of honesty. The home that once represented stability now stood as a reminder of how easily appearances can mislead, how something can exist in plain sight without ever being fully understood. The verdict brought a form of closure, but it didn't answer everything. Because cases like this leave behind more than just a conclusion, they leave behind questions about how something like this can go unnoticed for so long, how moments that seem small can connect into something far more serious when viewed together. The perfect family that neighbors once described was never perfect. It was carefully maintained, shaped in a way that kept certain truths out of view while presenting something easier to accept. And in the end, what made it so convincing wasn't that it was flawless, it was that it was believable. Because the reality is, nothing about it was as it seemed. The smiles, the routines, the quiet consistency, all of it served a purpose. It created a version of life that no one thought to question, a version that held together until it couldn't anymore. And when it finally broke, it revealed something that had been there all along, just out of sight, waiting for the moment it could no longer be hidden. The perfect family was never perfect. It was simply better at hiding the truth than anyone else. Do you think the warning signs in Michael Reynolds and Laura Reynolds' story were there all along, hidden in those quiet moments people dismissed, or was this something no one could have truly seen coming until it was too late? When you look back at everything that surfaced, the small changes, the subtle distance, the details that didn't quite fit, it raises a question that stays with you long after the story ends. How well do we really know the people closest to us, and how often do we overlook the signs because they don't seem serious enough at the time? Let me know what you think in the comments. I'd really like to hear your perspective on this. And if you thought this story was disturbing, the next one is even darker, one that challenges everything you think you understand about trust, truth, and the lives people choose to present to the world.